First of all, I'm very honored to be the lecturer for this memorial event, and I see a lot of friendly faces in the audience that I've known for many years. And so I must say I'm a little bit nervous, maybe even a little bit more than a little bit. But anyway, the other thing is I want to do is that this lecture is very personal in many ways, and I want to dedicate it to my analyst, colleague, and friend and teacher, Joseph Henderson, because without his guidance through 45 years of knowing him, I would not be here this afternoon, evening. So with that, I will begin the formal part of the lecture. The lecture is actually the arc of Jung's influence on my life. You could also call it going into the family business. And my introduction, or Jung's introduction into my life, occurred on June 25th, 1936, at which time he wrote a very short note to my father, which was to say that to the birth of your son, I congratulate you and your wife. With best greetings, C.G. Jung. The whole letter, but that shapes what has happened for the next almost 80 years. So that was my first connection to Jung and analytical psychology. Of course, I wasn't aware, I was just 2 weeks old. My father, with his new wife, Hilda Silber, a former patient of his, had arrived in London 10 months before to begin new lives. They had left Germany in 1933 after Hitler had come to power and had resettled in Palestine. My father had been an ardent Zionist, and that's why he moved to Palestine, but became disillusioned by his experience in Palestine, and after many months, they decided to move to London and the UK, and the idea was to settle there for the rest of their lives. Now, some of you who may have been at last year's conference on Erich Neumann may realize that my father and Erich Neumann somehow did not get along very well. There was a sibling rivalry, and I don't know what effect that had on my parents deciding to leave Palestine at the time. It's very hard to imagine both of them having been in that same small country. My parents both had 2 children from one previous marriage, each of them. And I was, the projection on me was that I was the concretization of what analyzed patients, when they have children, should turn out to be like. In retrospect, what I turned out to be should have been, in psychological terms, an inner child for each of them, rather than a concretization. Now, this was early on in Jungian analysis. The goals for analysis were extremely idealistic, and my birth was actually questioned because was it appropriate to have a child in these conditions with Hitler and the Nazis, and kind of war was looming on the horizon. Now here, I'm going to show you two photos. That's me in London, age maybe 3 months, okay, with my mother. And then that's my father, not at the same time, but that's where I put him in. Now, can I turn this down? Well, we'll leave it on. When World War II began in 1939, it looked as if Great Britain would succumb to the forces of the Wehrmacht, and that all of Europe, including Great Britain, would be under Nazi domination. My father, having been born in Guatemala by a fluke, his father was a German Jewish businessman, and a lot of those people came in the late 19th century to the United States. Central America and South America and started businesses. The German and UK quotas to come to the United States were oversubscribed, so it would have been difficult to find passage. But because of that, having been born in Guatemala, we were able to come to the United States, and my father had two uncles in San Francisco who offered to sponsor him. This is the boat that we went on. It's called the Samaria. We were part of a convoy, and the person I was editing my memoir with was an ancestry person, and she found this picture of the boat. It actually was damaged, not in this crossing, but in subsequent crossings, but it still was in use as a cruise ship until 1956, at which time it was mothballed. So, and when I first saw this, I just broke into tears, because we crossed during the time when the U-boats were sinking quite a few of the British shipping. And every day we would go out on the deck and practice, getting, lifeboats, getting on lifeboats. And we got attacked quite a few times, but we did make it into New York Harbor. So that's the boat. And then this is the passenger list from that boat. Now you can see James Kirsch, Hildegard, Rudolf Silber, that was my oldest half-brother, and then Gerhard Silber, and then Ruth was my father's daughter, and then me. And you can see that we were all noted to be Hebrews in the last column. And so this is, I kind of was interesting to get a hold of this little document. And so we ended up in Los Angeles after my father visited his uncles in San Francisco. And he had reminded him of Guatemala and Tel Aviv. And so we ended up in the end of 1940 in Los Angeles, and when they immediately began to develop a Jungian community there, and then were joined by Max and Laura Zeller 6 months later. Almost immediately, my father began to give evening seminars, first at the time mainly untranslated works of Jung, which then he continued to give seminars on the translated works of Jung, all the alchemical works. And my mother developed a large practice. She was actually the more related person of the two of them. And my father continued to give a weekly seminar from 1941 to 1988 in Los Angeles. And my parents were, the last time that they had seen Jung personally was 1938 in Oxford at the last International Congress of the International Society. And they were cut off from him. They had one letter in 1941, but during the war there was no correspondence. And actually, Jung had, in that letter in 1941, my parents were already in Los Angeles, and Jung chastised my mother for them moving to Los Angeles. They should have stayed put in England, was what he said. My mother asked me frequently about my dreams. I told them to her. I was fascinated by what she could make of them and her insights, and only later in my own analysis did I realize that there was a level, not only was it helpful, but there was a level of intrusiveness that she was in my psyche much too much. When she died, she left me a letter that I was to read upon her death. And in that letter was a dream that I had as a young boy, which she wanted to make sure that I noted, where I was swallowed up by the moon. And she felt this was a very important message for me. So I took this message to my analyst at the time, Joe Henderson, and we obviously discussed, interpreted, etc., the meaning of being swallowed up by the moon. And my mother was rightly concerned that my ego would be overpowered by the Great Mother archetype represented by the moon. So that's what I was left with. Now, I found my father's weekly meetings, seminars, intrusive to my own interests, but I tolerated them easier than my siblings, who developed a rather negative attitude towards Jung, whom none of us had met. And but I found my dreams fascinating and followed them on a sporadic level. Most of my energy was directed towards adapting to living in Southern California, and which was a very different way of life than I'd had in London. I was sent to Hebrew school. I had a bar mitzvah, and my next significant contact, Jungian contact, came when I'm not sure, I was either 14 or 15. I had developed a strong interest in playing tennis, and I would play every afternoon and every weekend, several hours. And in Southern California, there's very little rain, so that one can basically play all year round. It rarely got rained out. And my parents were concerned about the amount of time that I devoted to tennis and not to my studies. I was a good student, but not outstanding or anything. And they felt I should be reading more of the classics. So, and less time on sports. As a consequence, my mother sent my horoscope, which of course they had noted exactly the minute that I was delivered in London, and so I was right on the meridian of, right where it all begins. And so they sent my horoscope to Ernst Bernhard in Rome. And they had known him in Berlin, and he had wanted to follow his friends from Berlin to London, but he was a physician, but he was also an astrologer. And the Home Office in London thought that was a little risky, and so they didn't let him in. So he went to Italy instead and became the first Jungian analyst in Italy. He was on house arrest all during the war until Rome was liberated in 1944. And then he became the first Jungian analyst in Rome and was the founder of all the different Italian Jungian groups that exist today. He analyzed my horoscope and replied to my parents that they should not worry about me. My interest in athletics was normal, and that I would become more interested in academics later on in my life. I think my parents were concerned that I would not become a Jungian analyst, and that is why they contacted Bernhardt. This is Ernst Bernhardt with my mother here in Zurich at Faun, right at the corner of Remistrasse and Hottingerstrasse, 1953. My parents wanted to spend when I was a junior in high school, they wanted to spend a year here in Zurich. I was deeply enmeshed in my athletic and social life and made it clear that I did not want to do that. And they realized that it was important for me to have a continuity in my high school experience. So what they did is, instead coming for 2 months each, they'd come separately and do their analysis with C.A. Meyer and see Jung on occasion. By this time, there was a group of at least 50 people in Los Angeles interested in Jungian psychology. And through my parents, they began a fund in order to invite prominent and host prominent analysts from Zurich and London. And at the time, the exchange rate was very favorable for the Americans and against the European currency. And so that's how I first met von Franz, Rivka Scherf, Gerhard Adler, Michael Fordham, and Ziggy Hurwitz. Life was very exciting when one of these analysts was in town. Then I graduated from high school, and my father and I, as a graduation present, my father and I traveled to Europe, where my mother was already here in Zurich in analysis, and we met up with my mother here, but we went first to London and Paris, which both were still very much under the influence of World War II, and quite, especially London was rubble. There were lots of rubble, and they were trying to clean it up because this was the year of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. I arrived in Zurich in the end of July of 1953. It was an amazing experience. After having experienced war-torn England and France, Switzerland seemed like paradise. Everything worked and was on time. There was no evidence of destruction. And on Sunday morning, one heard the church bells all through the city, and it was a wonderful experience to have that. I met my parents' friends again. I met Meyer, Liliana Fry, Aniela Yaffe, the Hurwitz family, von Franz and Barbara Hanna, and probably others who I can't remember now, but I remember that's what we did. My mother wanted me to have an hour of analysis with Meyer with the idea, that an hour with him with the idea that I might have analysis with him. We had a very pleasant hour, but he suggested that I should let my neuroses grow. And come back when they're more fully formed. So, actually, that's what I did. I mean, 4 years later. And I especially liked the Hurwitz family because they had 2 children, very talented, one in art and one in music. And they were more or less my age. And I was, we had no Jewish rituals in our home. My father had grown up an Orthodox Jew and found his family completely materialistic and had rejected that. And I enjoyed the Hurwitz family practicing a minimum of Jewish ritual. I returned to the United States, entered college with a new sense of purpose. I had read Modern Man in Search of a Soul over that summer. It had just come out in paperback. And I thought consciously for the first time that I would become a Jungian analyst. At that time in the United States, it was important to have a medical degree to become any kind of an analyst. And so I chose a pre-medical major, and I realized I had to do well academically in order to get into medical school. Because number one, Jung was considered extremely marginal in those days, and there was only 1 or 2 Jungians in academia at the time. None of the Jungians in Los Angeles had the proper credentials. They were a lawyer. My mother had no degree. My father had an MD from Germany, which he couldn't use. I mean, it was very, very marginalized. And I was groomed to obtain all the proper credentials, then return to Los Angeles and lead the professional Jungians there. I didn't know quite that was expected of me, but that's what I got it. Then, in February of 1955, much to my surprise and delight, Jung's face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Now, this is, pre-everything, and there were 2 sources of news in those days. It was Time magazine or Newsweek. So to have your picture and on the cover of Time magazine was a big deal. And I was quite pleased at the time, and it was a very nice article. And in the spring of 1956, then my parents came to visit me in college, and my dad offered to do an introductory lecture on Jung. This was in Portland, Oregon. And much to my surprise, there was a packed audience, including many of my professors, and my father gave an excellent lecture. And this changed my attitude towards him. I began to respect his intellectual capacities and forgave him for some of the psychological wounds that had occurred between the 2 of us. Now, in the summer of 1955, it was just a little bit better, but in the United States, college students could come to Europe and survive very well on $5 a day. So I came with 3 other students, and we came first to London, and there I developed severe abdominal cramps, and I went to make an appointment to a doctor in the brand new British National Medical Scheme, and they said I could have an appointment in 6 weeks. I would have been dead in 6 weeks, okay? So we called my mother, who was in Zurich. And this is typical of my mother. Arranged a flight to come to Zurich the next day, rushed me to the Weizspital, and under ether, I had my appendix taken out that afternoon, and the doctor left for his vacation the next day. So and everything worked out just fine. But in those days, when you had an operation, you stayed in the hospital for a couple weeks, a week, and lo and behold, it was July 1955, and there was a public party for Jung's 80th birthday, the Grand Hotel Dolder. So my mother thought, without asking, said, "You're coming with me to that party." And so I did go to this party, and she snuck me into the receiving line, and I shook hands with Dr. Jung, and he seemed rather pleased that she'd done that. I mean, you know, he did like kind of that you didn't do always the right thing. And but what I remember from that meeting was the handshake. And it was very warm, and it almost felt like there was an electricity going on in my body with the handshake. And for many years, I thought, oh, well, this is just because what I'd heard about Jung from my parents and everybody else, and it was all just my fantasy. However, in 2010, at the Library of Congress, one of Jung's many grandchildren mentioned that a handshake with his grandfather was the thing that he remembered most about him. So I figured, well, it's not all in my head or psyche, that there was something to this handshake. Now, the next summer, 1956, my parents again went to Zurich because my mother was the delegate for the newly forming IAAP. And this gave my father a chance to visit Jung and express his condolence for the death of Emma, who had died the previous November. So we had an afternoon tea, and that year I read 2 essays on analytical psychology. Now I was, you know, kind of a sophomoric philosopher. And I found a statement in 2 essays which said that all knowledge is relative. So I said to Jung, I was invited to this tea, and I said, well, isn't that an absolute statement? And I thought I was being kind of smart. And can't remember his reaction, but for me what's interesting is that I have taught 2 essays on analytical psychology many times since then, have read it many times, and I can't find that statement. So I don't know where it came from. It came from somewhere inside me. Yeah, the unconscious. Let's see, I've got a couple more. This is the terrace of the Sonnenberg Hotel, 1956, where they were breaking up for a meeting. That's Liliana Fry and Hella Adler, their daughter Miriam, and Gerhard is at the head of the table, Gerhard Adler. And I have a couple more pictures, but I didn't bring them. But anyway, this was the beginning of the IAP, so to speak. So then I graduated from college, and I went to I was thinking I should go to a Jewish medical school, so I went to Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, and I didn't like it at all. And I was feeling a number of pressures and thought it might be time for me to go back into analysis for the first time. So I arranged to come to Zurich in the summer of 1957, and I began with C.A. Meyer on a 3 times a week basis during that summer. And I lived in the service quarters of the Hotel Sonnenberg for $4 a day, including meals. This gave me a lot of time for introversion as well as playing tennis. Meyer suggested that I read Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, because he saw that I mean, it's probably true, that I had an inferior thinking function, and he thought that if I read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, that would really help my thinking function. So I dutifully read the book. I actually enjoyed it. And meanwhile, that summer, I came to know some of the students at the Institute. There were only about 30 at the time, and it was a pretty small place. And David Hart, Jim Hillman, Bob Stein, and Marv Spiegelman. I began to play tennis with them on a regular basis, and I heard a lot of the gossip around the Institute. I also audited the course on the Puer Aeternus by Mary Louise von Franz, and in those days it was much easier to audit a class without, a lot of formalities. And at the end of that summer, I joined the Hurwitz family and their 2 children, and we did camping around Florence. So I think I'll show you. There's Liliana Fry, Ziggy Hurwitz, Rivka Kluger and my mother, Rivka Sheriff, Aniela Yaffe, and C.A. Meyer. This is a picture just a few months before he died. And there is von Franz when she came to Los Angeles in 1952. There's Adolf Guggenbuhl. We'll go back. Then this is an interesting photo. This is the photo from the first Congress in 1958. And I don't know all the people in this group, but maybe there are people in this audience who know all of them. But there's Hilda Binswanger, Mary Breener, Kurt Binswanger, Max Zeller. In the back row is Bernhardt and Adler and Moody, Ricklin. That's quite a few of those people. So, anyway, since I wasn't comfortable at Albert Einstein, I transferred, which was very hard in those days. I transferred to Yale Medical School, which was a very good choice. And I came back another summer, 1958, to continue my work with Meyer. And I also saw Liliana Fry when Meyer was away on vacation. My father was also in Zurich that summer. We actually shared an apartment on Plattenstrasse, just around the corner from Meyer's office in Steinwiestrasse. And we lived together but had separate lives. One day, Aniela Yaffe called and said to my father that Jung can see you on this Friday. And he said, well, I can't do it because I have to teach at the Institute. And he said, could my son come in my place? So she said, well, I have to ask Professor Jung about that, blah, blah, blah. She called back a few minutes later and said, Jung would be delighted to see your son. So this set up a whole thing, because you didn't go to Jung to talk about, at this point in his life, he was 1958, 82, or 83. You went there with your material that might help him with his research. Okay? So, I had some dreams that Meyer thought would be very interesting for Jung. And they were about intersecting circles. And at the time, Jung was working on his monograph on flying saucers, a modern myth in the sky. So thought that these would be appropriate for that theme. So when I entered the study, you can imagine I was more nervous than I am tonight. And I will sit down and Jung says to me, so, you want to see the old man before he dies, do you? Completely undid me. I can't remember a single thing that we talked about after that for the next over hour, okay? And it was, I must have told him these dreams of these intersecting circles and God knows what, and mandalas, and but I can't, but it didn't register at all. But his directness, I didn't realize it at the time, but his directness affected me very clearly, and I think unconsciously I realized that's when I wanted to really become a Jungian analyst, because I liked his directness and the feeling that I had in the room with him. And so that was a very formative 1 hour with him. Later that summer, the first IAP Congress was held in Zurich, but I was told by my analyst Meyer, get the hell out of here, you don't belong here. I was only 22, and I had no business being there, so I did leave. I went to London and just came back at the end of the Congress. Now, I began my psychiatric residency in 1962 at Stanford, and I became a candidate in the San Francisco Jung Institute in 1963. And what I didn't realize was, for the first time, I was in a regular analysis with an analyst in the same city, and I didn't have to travel, and it wasn't also somebody who was the analyst of my parents. And this gives you an idea of just how the boundary issues were pretty loose. And so I started analysis with Joe Henderson, who became my primary analyst, teacher, colleague, and friend until his death in 2007 at the age of 104. My primary allegiance shifted to San Francisco, and my earlier connections to Zurich and Los Angeles were transformed in the process. Not rejected, just transformed. So then I had not a good first marriage. I don't want to go into that now, but then I remarried Jean, who's with me now, in 1969. And so we came to Zurich, and I introduced her to all these friends, people. And I love coming here, and I love visiting, and but I've never lived here. And there were two occasions when I could have lived here. possibly. The first one was applying to medical school, and I thought very seriously of doing it in Zurich because there was, but I decided against it because at that time there was a quota system against Jews in the going to American medical schools, and so that if you went to a foreign medical school, that was held that you hadn't been able to get into an American medical school. And I didn't want that stigma attached to me for the rest of my professional life. So I eventually decided to go, I went to Einstein and then Yale. And that was just what it was. The second opportunity occurred in 1973. C.A. Meyer was retiring as professor at the ETH, and he was looking for someone to take over the professorship. I had done research on rapid eye movement and dreams, which was also at the time a strong interest of Meyer's, and he asked me if I would be interested in the position. But it came at a time when I had established myself in Palo Alto, and Jean would have moved to Zurich, but as much as I have enjoyed visiting Zurich, I chose to stay in Palo Alto. Moving to Zurich in 1973 would have been a major midlife transition. Interesting enough, that position has never again been fulfilled by a Jungian. Now, 1971, first IAP Congress outside of Switzerland. I was nominated by Joe Wheelwright and James Hillman to be second vice president of the IAP. Now, they did not tell me that they were going to do this. So I go into the delegates meeting, and suddenly I'm getting nominated for second vice president. I lost by one vote at that time, and it's actually a disputed vote, but I decided not to. I wasn't ready for it anyway. So in 1977 in Rome, when the next election came up, I did get elected second vice president. I did not require, in Switzerland, as you all know, you don't require a second for the nomination. But Meyer was at this delegates meeting, probably the last Congress he had attended, and he got up, again unannounced, and seconded my nomination. Well, Adolf Guggenbuhl became president, and Jim Hillman became his honorary secretary. And after the election, and after the end of the meeting, Jim comes up to me and he says, "You are still talking to Freddie Meyer? What's wrong with you that you're still on speaking terms with him?" And this is how we begun our 3 years of of the IAP second vice president. Over the next 18 years, a new phase grew in my relationship to Jung, analytical psychology, and Zurich. The Guggenbuhls invited me to stay at their house whenever I came to Zurich for IAP meetings. I developed relationships with Adolf Tony Fry, Mario Jacobi, Sonia Mariash, and I still maintain some relationship with the first generation of analysts, which is a little uncomfortable at times. For the last 12 years of the vice presidency and presidency, I came to Zurich at least twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, traveled either alone or with family. And in 1989, when I became president, the IAP was primarily a European organization with several satellite American societies. But during the beginning of my presidency, the Berlin Wall fell. The rest of the world seemed to open up to analytical psychology. And a big issue was how to respond to the many requests that we were receiving from all over the world to learn more about Jung and analytical psychology. They came from Eastern Europe, Russia, Soviet Union, Latin America, and Asia. Now, I had been quite a missionary for Jung when I began my analysis in San Francisco in 1962, because I thought it was doing such wonderful things for me. I mean, who knows? But that's the way it felt to me. And I had wanted all my friends and colleagues to go into Jungian analysis. By 1989, I'd backed off a lot from that. And my missionary zeal was about 2%. And I didn't want to go out anymore. And my connection to analytical psychology and my unconscious was more inward than getting everybody else involved. And I had experienced the shadow of my missionary zeal. And I saw this most poignantly when I went to the Soviet Union. Because when the Soviet Union opened up, these young Russian psychotherapists had no idea of the history in the West to all the psychoanalytic movements and conflicts and this and that. And so it was really like a whole bunch of salesmen and women came to the Soviet Union and put out their wares. And so the Jungian, as a Jungian, that's kind of what we did. We told them about our psychotherapy, and I knew very well that it was unlikely any of them would become Jungian analysts. We did try to make an official, one of the big things we tried to do was make an official Russian translation of the collected works. But that turned out to be, with Russian politics, with Yeltsin and Gorbachev and all that kind of stuff, it became very impossible. We got one volume translated, volume 15, the art, literature, and because they had no idea of psychotherapy. And they were not part of the International Copyright Association. They didn't follow copyright laws, so anybody could make a translation and just sell it on the street. So none of them were authorized. Even our translation came from the English version, not from the German. So it wasn't really, it was all very difficult. Now, I think the question is how much missionary zeal should the IAAP exert? And how much should the IAAP respond to requests from afar for Jungian analysis and training? I think this is an issue that's probably pretty potent here in Zurich and remains rather controversial. I did a lot of travel as IAAP president. Some people didn't like that, but the demand was just exponentially grew. And all other administrations after mine have done the same. The demand for Jungian ideas remains strong, and at the present time, Asia seems to be the fastest growing area of interest. Now, I have no idea what Jung would have liked. I believe he would have enjoyed, been satisfied that people were reading him and understanding more about the unconscious. And he felt not many people really did understand him, the unconscious, and his ideas about it. And I don't think that situation is that much different today. So that's kind of what I have to say. I'm going to give you a concluding paragraph or two, which is kind of going to go over what I've said. and then I will take questions. In conclusion, Jung as an image and reality has been ever changing for me. My early life, he was a distant and important image because he was clearly the most important person outside the immediate family. That affected all of us children in different ways. Through my mother especially, I found great value in my dreams. The next phase was meeting first generation Jungians in Zurich as a teenager, and these colleagues of my parents intrigued me greatly, and I was attracted to the field of analytical psychology. Then I had a need for analysis, and I saw Jungian in Zurich, and luckily had a chance to meet Jung in person. That was life-changing. After being tempted to study and train in Zurich, I returned to the United States and did my major analysis and training in San Francisco. That was another life-changing transition. Early in my analysis, and it was only 4 years after I'd actually met Jung, I had a lot of dreams with Jung as a dream image in my psyche. And these dreams helped me to separate from my identification with Jung the person, and he became more of a symbol of finding one's own individual way, which for me has been extroverted, feeling intuitive. I was not the introverted thinking type that my parents wanted me to be, so I could be like Jung. And this brought me into the international political and administrative world of analytical psychology, which suited me very well. I continued to have a relationship with Joe Henderson until his death. And I was actually at his death when he was at 104. I was in the hospital with him. And this helped me to keep my introverted side while I was living out my extroverted side with this political and administrative stuff. My wife has also been an important influence in keeping me grounded. So Jung has been in my life from that very first letter in 1936 until now. The image of Jung continues to evolve in my psyche. And that's kind of where it is right now. So I want to thank you for your kind attention, and I'll take questions.